Stalin and Trotsky were associates of Lenin and played key roles in the 1917 revolution. They stood side by side as the Russian Empire crumbled, and it seemed like an alliance for the ages. But a few years later, everything changed. One became a ruler whose fear inspired terror, and the other an exile feared even abroad. Lev Trotsky was a brilliant and charismatic orator whose speeches inspired crowds. He led the Red Army and played a key role in the Bolshevik victory in the Civil War. He was called the engine of the revolution. Joseph Stalin, on the other hand, preferred to remain in the shadows. He was not a brilliant orator or military leader, but he could weave intrigue and find weaknesses in people. After Lenin's death in 1924, a power struggle began. Lenin, feeling that his health was deteriorating, wrote a letter in which he explicitly warned that Stalin was too tough and could become a dictator. This letter Lenin willed to be read at the party congress, but Stalin did his best to hide it. As a result, Lenin's warning was learned of too late. Trotsky, on the other hand, seemed to many the logical successor to Lenin. He was smart, popular, and had real authority. But Stalin had other plans. When Lenin died, Trotsky was away from Moscow at that moment, receiving medical treatment. Stalin gave him the wrong date for the funeral, and Trotsky ended up being late. This seemed like a disrespect to Lenin. This move by Stalin worked. Trotsky lost some support and Stalin strengthened his position. But it wasn't just ideas that were at the heart of their enmity. Stalin was jealous of Trotsky's influence, and Trotsky despised Stalin, considering him crude and mediocre. Their conflict was not only a struggle for power, but also a clash of characters. Imagine a country that has survived the revolution and the Civil War. The economy is ruined. Millions of people dream of simply surviving. And at this point, the two leaders begin to argue. One says we should prepare for new revolutions abroad, and the other says it's time to strengthen order at home. This argument between Stalin and Trotsky was no ordinary discussion. It divided the country and changed its history. Lev Trotsky believed that the Soviet Union was only the beginning. In his opinion, the revolution was to encompass the whole world. He argued, if we stop, the capitalist countries will simply crush us. He insisted that without the support of the world proletariat, the USSR could not survive. To understand what this looked like, imagine a fire that must spread to neighboring houses to burn out an entire street. Trotsky was certain, either revolution or defeat. Joseph Stalin saw things differently. He called Trotsky's plans a crazy adventure. For him, the USSR was like a fortress that needed to be fortified. Stalin put forward the idea of socialism in one country. This meant concentrating on building its economy and army. He used to say, "First, let's make our country strong, then we will be asked to help ourselves." Disagreements quickly went beyond theory. For example, Trotsky suggested sending resources, money, and people to support revolutions abroad. This would mean great sacrifice for the citizens of the USSR who were already living in poverty. At the same time, Stalin decided to put these resources into industrialization. Factories, electricity, and tractors were his building blocks of socialism. He believed that only a strong economy would protect the country from external enemies. What was the problem? Trotsky saw Stalin's position as a betrayal. For him, the idea of socialism in one country was a rejection of the main goal of the revolution, the liberation of the working class around the world. In his book, he wrote, "Stalin sold the dream of revolution for a sack of coal and steel." Stalin, for his part, saw Trotsky as a threat. He said that world revolution could drag the USSR into a war for which the country was unprepared. Their arguments were not just words. For example, in 1927, Trotsky tried to organize rallies in support of world revolution. but Stalin already controlled the party at that time and declared these rallies illegal. Thousands of Trotsky supporters were arrested. Trotsky called it the beginning of a dictatorship, while Stalin said it was saving the country from catastrophe. But here are a couple of surprising conclusions. First, the dispute wasn't just about revolution. It was a struggle over what the USSR would be, an ideological dream or a real power. Second, both leaders were right in their own way. Trotsky's ideas inspired revolutionary movements in other countries, but Stalin made the USSR strong enough to survive World War II. Imagine you are a leader who has helped change the course of history, but suddenly you see your influence slipping away and your enemies plotting to take everything away from you. That's exactly what happened to Leon Trotsky when Stalin began his plan to eliminate him. But Stalin did not launch an open war. He acted more cunningly, methodically, and, most importantly, ruthlessly. After Lenin's death, Trotsky was still an influential figure. He was respected for his successes in the Civil War and was considered the main ideologue of the revolution. But he had a weakness. He often told the truth to his face, which created enemies even among his associates. Stalin quickly realized this and began to act from the shadows. His first weapon was words. Stalin organized a real campaign against Trotsky. In newspapers and at meetings began to say that Trotsky is not loyal to Soviet power, that he is working for foreign intelligence. In essence, Stalin turned Trotsky into an enemy of the people, although at that time he did not even have an army to resist. For example, he was accused of having ties with England. Allegedly, he wanted to sell secrets of the Soviet Union in exchange for power. In 1928, Trotsky was sent into exile in Alma-Ata, where he was completely isolated from active political life. But even this was not the end. A year later, Stalin decided to remove Trotsky from the USSR for good. He was exiled first to Turkey, then he ended up in Europe, and then generally in Mexico. All this time, he was followed by the shadow of Soviet agents, watching his every move. Why was Stalin so afraid of Trotsky? He realized that even in exile, Trotsky could be dangerous. His ideas inspired people all over the world, especially in Europe. But Stalin's main fear was different. He knew that Trotsky could return if serious problems started in the USSR, such as a revolt against Stalin's rule. What became of Trotsky next? How did he continue to fight against Stalin thousands of kilometers away from the Soviet Union? And why didn't Stalin stop before he took him out for good? When Trotsky found himself abroad, many thought that he would disappear from political life. But he had no intention of giving up. Away from the USSR, Trotsky continued to write, publishing books and articles that exposed Stalin's actions and his repression. He openly called Stalin's rule a dictatorship and denounced mass arrests, censorship, and murder in the USSR. All this irritated Stalin, who did not want anyone to undermine his power, even outside the country. Stalin could not allow Trotsky to remain a living symbol of resistance, especially when Trotsky's influence began to grow. His articles were read in France, Germany, the United States, and Latin America. Even in exile, he remained a leader for those who dreamed of a real revolution. Then Stalin gave a direct order: eliminate Trotsky by any means necessary. From that moment on, Trotsky's life became a constant struggle for survival. At first, there were attempts to undermine his reputation. Soviet propaganda spread rumors that Trotsky was linked to the Nazis and foreign intelligence. But when these attempts did not work, Stalin decided to go for tougher measures. The first serious assassination attempt occurred in 1937, when Trotsky was already living in Mexico. One night, his house was attacked by armed men. They opened a barrage of fire, firing dozens of bullets into the house. Trotsky miraculously survived, hiding in the dark behind furniture. He realized that now he was in mortal danger, but did not stop writing and speaking. Trotsky's life in Mexico became a life under constant fear. His house was more like a fortress. High fences were erected around it, and guards were on duty nearby. But he knew that any defense could be useless if Stalin was serious about killing him. In 1940, Trotsky was still living in Mexico in his fortress home. There he spent his days working and continued to write, predicting that Stalin's regime would collapse because of its brutality. He knew that Stalin would not leave him alone, and he feared an assassination attempt. But no one expected the assassin to be so close. He was a Spaniard, Ramon Mercader, an agent of the NKVD who was assigned a special mission. Mercader, 6 months, infiltrated Trotsky's entourage. He, under the guise of a journalist and a friend, managed to gain the trust of his associates and even Trotsky himself. Ramon often visited his home, brought books, and participated in conversations. He carefully studied the habits of his victim in order to choose the right moment to attack. On August 20th, 1940, Mercader came to Trotsky on the pretext of discussing an article. He brought the manuscript and asked for advice. Trotsky took him to his office to talk privately. At one point, Mercader pulled out an ice pick and hit Trotsky in the head. But suddenly, Trotsky screamed and even tried to fight back. This scream attracted the guards, who immediately apprehended the assassin, but the wound was fatal. The next day, Trotsky died in hospital. Ramon Mercader was arrested by Mexican authorities and sentenced to 20 years in prison. But to Stalin, he became a hero. In recognition of his services, Stalin awarded Mercader the Order of the Red Banner and provided his family with everything they needed. The duel between Stalin and Trotsky was not just a conflict between two people. It was a fight over what the Soviet Union would become. By removing Trotsky, Stalin not only became the full ruler, but also changed the direction of all of Soviet history. However, Trotsky's ideas, even after his death, continued to live on and influence the world. This conflict was not only a tragedy for one man, but also a key turning point in the country's history. After Trotsky was eliminated, Stalin consolidated his power to an absolute level. Without competitors, he could carry out any reforms and repression without fear of criticism. This led to a period that went down in history as the Stalinist repressions. Millions of people were victims of purges, false accusations, and gulag camps. For example, in 1937 and 38, more than 1.5 million people were arrested on political charges in 2 years alone. This scale was possible precisely because there was no longer a figure in the party who could openly oppose Stalin. But on the other hand, Trotsky's ideas about world revolution outlived him. Although the USSR tried to forget about him, abroad he became a symbol of the struggle for justice. In many countries, from Latin America to Europe, Trotskyist parties sprang up to promote his ideas. For example, in 1938, Trotsky created the Fourth International, an organization that would unite supporters of world revolution. Even decades after his death, his books and articles continue to inspire left-wing activists around the world. Trotsky's removal removed Stalin's only strong opponent, allowing him to pursue policies often based on fear and repression. But despite Stalin's best efforts, he was never able to destroy Trotsky's legacy. The duel between Stalin and Trotsky did not end in assassination. It continued its impact on the world. Stalin remained in history as one of the most brutal dictators, and Trotsky as a symbol of revolution and resistance.